I've been a trucker for close to 15 years, and I've seen my share of odd things out on the highways. Strange weather, weird people at rest stops, and once, even a herd of cattle wandering across the interstate in the dead of night. But nothing, not even the ghost stories truckers swap at truck stops, prepared me for what I experienced one autumn night in 2020. It started like any other long haul. I was transporting building materials from Fargo, North Dakota, to Salt Lake City, Utah. The route was straightforward, mostly lonely highways cutting through vast, empty landscapes. I didn't mind the solitude. It gave me time to think and enjoy the peace of the open road. But that night, peace was the last thing I found. It was around 11 p.m., and I was cruising down a desolate stretch of Highway 287. The night was clear, the stars brilliant against the pitch-black sky. The radio was playing softly, and I was nursing my third cup of coffee to stay awake. Suddenly, in the distance behind me, I noticed a faint glow. At first, I thought it was just another truck catching up, but the lights grew brighter and then multiplied. Within minutes, 3 semis roared past me in perfect unison. They were identical, same make, same color, and even the same company logo on the side. What struck me most was how pristine they looked, as if they just rolled off the assembly line. The lead truck honked twice as it passed, and I gave a friendly nod, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about them was off. Maybe it was the silence. Despite their speed, I barely heard their engines. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the late hour and my overactive imagination. Convoys weren't unusual on this route, after all. An hour later, I saw them again. The same 3 trucks were parked on the shoulder, their hazard lights flashing in eerie synchronization. The orange glow of their lights bathed the roadside in a surreal, almost otherworldly hue. I slowed down, expecting to see the drivers checking their trailers or chatting beside their cabs. But the trucks were empty. No drivers, no movement, just the steady hum of their idling engines and the rhythmic flash of their hazards. My stomach churned as I passed. Where were the drivers? Why had they left their trucks in the middle of nowhere? I told myself they were probably just off relieving themselves or taking a break, but the sight left me unsettled. As the night wore on, the temperature plummeted. The thermometer in my cab read 24 degrees Fahrenheit, but the cold felt sharper, almost unnatural. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, empty and silent, with only my headlights to cut through the darkness. Then, just past mile marker 126, I saw them again. The 3 trucks were parked on a dirt turnout, their hazard lights still blinking in perfect rhythm. This time, I slowed down to a crawl, trying to get a better look. My heart raced as I realized these were the same trucks I'd seen earlier. The same make, the same logos, the same eerie perfection. What the hell is going on? I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. As I passed the turnout, one of the trucks turned off its hazards. Its headlights flared to life, cutting through the darkness as it pulled back onto the highway. I watched in my mirrors as it started following me, its high beams glaring into my cab. Panic began to set in. I hit the gas, hoping to put some distance between us, but my truck was loaded heavy, and I couldn't gain much speed. The pursuing truck stayed close, its headlights flickering on and off in a rhythmic pattern that felt almost like a taunt. I grabbed my CB radio, switching to an open channel. "Breaker, breaker," I said, my voice shaking. "This is Big Sky on 287. I think I've got a tail, and I don't know what their deal is. Anyone out there?" Static crackled for a moment before a voice replied, low and urgent. "Where are you?" "About 30 miles from the state line," I said. "What's going on?" The line went silent for a moment before the voice came back. "You need to get off that road. Now." "What do you mean?" I asked, my chest tightening. "Just trust me. Find the nearest exit and get off. Before it's too late." The radio went dead. I barely had time to process the warning when another set of headlights appeared in front of me. The 2 other trucks from the convoy were parked across both lanes of the highway, forming a blockade. My heart pounded as I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt. My trailer skidded slightly, but I managed to stop just short of the blockade. Behind me, the truck that had been following turned off its lights, plunging the road into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling so badly I could barely dial. Just as I hit 911, the trucks ahead of me started moving. They turned off onto a narrow dirt road, their trailers swaying slightly as they disappeared into the trees. The truck behind me followed, its headlights flickering once before it vanished. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the cold seeping into my bones as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. When the 911 dispatcher finally answered, I stammered out my location and what I'd seen. By the time a state trooper arrived, the convoy was long gone. The officer searched the area but found no trace of the trucks or the dirt road they'd turned onto. "You've been on the road too long," he said, not unkindly. "Get some rest." But I know what I saw. The identical trucks, the synchronized movements, the way they seemed to appear and disappear at will. It wasn't fatigue or imagination. It was something else, something I can't explain. To this day, whenever I drive that stretch of Highway 287, I keep one eye on the road and the other on my mirrors. And every time, I pray I don't see those headlights again. Truckers often joke that the rearview mirror is like a portal to your worst fears. The dark, empty roads at night have a way of playing tricks on your mind, making you think you see things that aren't really there. For years, I thought that was all it was, just tricks of the mind. But one night, deep in the New Mexico desert, I learned otherwise. I was hauling a load of auto parts from Phoenix to Amarillo, an overnight run that I'd done countless times before. The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, lit only by the occasional street lamp or the glow of my headlights. I'd always loved this route. The vast emptiness felt liberating, a stark contrast to the congestion of city streets. That night, though, something about the emptiness felt wrong. It wasn't just quiet. It was too quiet. No other cars, no distant hum of life. Just me and the endless road. Around 2 a.m., I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. At first, it was just a shadow, flitting across the corner of the glass. I thought maybe it was a bird or some debris kicked up by the wind. But as I glanced back, I saw it again. This time more clearly. A figure, standing in the middle of the road behind me. "What the hell?" I muttered, slowing down slightly. The figure was tall and thin, its outline barely illuminated by my taillights. It didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, perfectly still, as if watching me. A shiver ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just a hitchhiker or a drifter. People did strange things out here. I sped up, eager to put some distance between us. But when I glanced in the mirror again, the figure was gone. For the next hour, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the mirror, shadows that didn't belong, flickers of something just out of sight. I turned up the radio, trying to drown out my unease, but the static only made it worse. The desert felt alive, like it was pressing in on me, watching. Around 3:30 a.m., I pulled into a rest stop. It was a small, desolate place with a couple of vending machines and a single, flickering street lamp. I parked the truck and climbed out, the cool desert air hitting my skin. The rest stop was completely empty, just me and the endless night. I walked over to the vending machines, fishing for some quarters. As I stood there, I heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps crunching on gravel. I turned quickly, scanning the lot. No one was there. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear. "Get a grip, man," I muttered. But as I turned back to the vending machine, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. In the mirror-like surface of the glass, a figure stood behind me. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but the lot was empty. The figure was gone. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my drink and climbed back into the truck, locking the doors behind me. As I pulled out of the rest stop, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure again. But the lot was empty, the street lamp casting long shadows over the pavement. For a while, I felt relieved. Maybe it really was just my imagination. But then, about 20 minutes down the road, I saw it again. The figure was standing on the side of the highway, illuminated briefly by my headlights. It was the same as before, tall, thin, and eerily still. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I sped past, not daring to slow down. In the mirror, I saw it step onto the road, its head turning as if following me. By now, my fear had turned into full-blown panic. I grabbed the CB radio and switched to an open channel. "Breaker, breaker," I said, my voice shaking. "This is Night Owl on Route 66. Anyone out there?" Static crackled for a moment before a voice replied. "Night Owl, this is Big Rig Pete. What's your 20? Just past mile marker 72, I said. I think I'm being followed." There was a pause. "Followed? By who?" "I don't know," I admitted. It's some kind of figure. I keep seeing it in my mirrors." The line went quiet again, and then Big Rig Pete's voice came back, low and serious. "Listen, Night Owl. If you're seeing something in your mirrors, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Just keep driving," he said, "and don't look back." For the next hour, I did exactly that. I kept my eyes on the road, resisting the urge to check the mirrors. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, almost unbearable. It was like a weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Finally, just before dawn, I reached a larger truck stop near the state line. The place was bustling with activity. Other truckers fueling up, grabbing coffee, and chatting by their rigs. I parked my truck and climbed out, the morning light washing over me like a blessing. I walked into the diner and ordered a coffee, my hands still trembling. As I sat there, staring into the cup, another trucker approached. He was older, with a weathered face and tired eyes. "You all right, son?" he asked, sitting across from me. "Yeah," I lied. "Just a long night." The man nodded knowingly. "Saw you pull in. You looked spooked. Let me guess, you saw something on the road?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, a figure. In my mirrors." The man sighed. "You're not the first. There's a stretch of 66 where strange things happen. People see shadows, figures that follow them. No one knows what they are, but one thing's for sure. You're lucky you didn't stop." "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man leaned in, his expression grim. "Because the ones who stop don't make it back." I left the diner feeling more unsettled than ever. I finished the haul and made it home safely, but that drive haunted me for weeks. To this day, I avoid Route 66 at night. And when I'm driving, I keep my mirrors angled just slightly away, because sometimes it's better not to see what's behind you. I've always considered rest stops to be a necessary evil. They're a place to stretch your legs, grab a quick snack, and maybe catch a nap before heading back on the road. But if you've spent as much time on the highway as I have, you'll know they're also magnets for trouble. I've heard enough trucker stories to know that the weirdest, most inexplicable things seem to happen at those lonely oases in the middle of nowhere. I never thought I'd have my own story to tell, until the night I stopped at Red Rock Rest Stop. It was late November, and I was driving through Colorado, hauling produce to a distribution center in Denver. A cold front had swept in, and the roads were slick with ice. By the time I hit mile marker 174, fatigue was setting in. My knuckles ached from gripping the wheel, and my eyes burned from staring at the endless white lines on the road. When I saw the sign for Red Rock Rest Stop, I decided to pull over. I wasn't familiar with it, but I figured it would be like every other rest stop, desolate, a little sketchy, but serviceable. All I needed was a hot coffee and a quick break to regain my focus. As I pulled into the lot, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. My headlights cut through the fog, illuminating rows of empty parking spaces. A single street lamp flickered near the entrance, casting distorted shadows on the asphalt. The small brick building that housed the restrooms and vending machines looked ancient, its windows fogged up from the cold. I parked near the vending machines and shut off the engine. The sudden silence was unnerving, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind. Wrapping my jacket tighter around me, I climbed out of the cab and made my way to the vending area. The machines were old, their glass fronts smeared with dirt and condensation. I fumbled for quarters, my breath visible in the frigid air, and punched in the code for a coffee. The machine whirred loudly, its gears grinding as the cup filled. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, scanning the lot. The dim glow from the street lamp barely lit the surrounding area, but I could see enough to know that I was alone. The footsteps stopped as soon as I moved, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly. "Is someone there?" No response. I shook my head and turned back to the vending machine, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But as I reached for the coffee, the footsteps started again, closer this time. My pulse quickened as I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. About 20 feet away, just beyond the edge of the street lamp's light, stood a man. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt his gaze, heavy and unrelenting. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint metallic smell that made my stomach churn. I took a step back, my hand tightening around the flashlight. "Hey man, if you're looking for a ride, I'm not your guy." Still nothing. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering me, then took a single step forward. That was all it took for me to bolt. I turned and sprinted back to the truck, my coffee forgotten, and slammed the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked the doors and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the lot, but the man was gone. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm my breathing. Maybe he was just a drifter, I told myself. Someone looking for warmth or a handout. But as I reached for the gear shift, something caught my eye. In the side mirror, a shadow moved, quick and deliberate. My heart jumped as I realized the man was circling the truck. "Damn it," I muttered, grabbing my phone. I dialed 911, my fingers fumbling on the screen. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, I kept my eyes glued to the mirrors, scanning for movement. "He's gone," I said after a minute, my voice shaking. "I don't see him anymore." "Stay in your vehicle," the dispatcher said firmly. "An officer is on the way." As I waited, the minutes dragged on, each one more agonizing than the last. The lot was eerily silent, the wind having died down completely. I kept expecting the man to reappear, to bang on the windows or try the door handles, but he never did. When the patrol car finally pulled in, its red and blue lights cutting through the fog, I felt a wave of relief. The officer stepped out, his flashlight scanning the lot. "You all right, sir?" he asked as I climbed out of the truck. "Yeah," I said, my voice still shaky. "There was a guy out here. He was acting weird, following me, staring at me." The officer nodded. "We get drifters through here sometimes. They usually stick to the shelters, but a few like to wander. Let me take a look around." The officer spent about 15 minutes searching the area, but he didn't find anything. No footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone hiding in the trees. When he came back, he gave me a sympathetic look. "Probably just your nerves," he said. "It's easy to spook yourself out here. You're miles from anywhere, and the isolation messes with your head." I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd seen. That man wasn't a figment of my imagination. I left the rest stop and didn't stop again until I reached Denver. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, especially whenever I parked for the night. And every so often, I'd catch myself glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see him again. To this day, I avoid Red Rock Rest Stop, and whenever I pull into a lot at night, I make sure to check my mirrors and lock my doors. The road that runs through the Blackwater Hills in northern Wyoming is one of the most desolate stretches of highway I've ever driven. It's a two-lane road, winding through dense forests and steep inclines, with no cell service and almost no traffic. Most truckers avoid it if they can, opting for longer, more heavily traveled routes. But when a late winter storm forced me to change my plans, I had no choice but to take the shortcut through Blackwater. That decision haunts me to this day. It was mid-February, and I was hauling a load of produce from Billings, Montana, to Cheyenne, Wyoming. The storm had shut down most of the major highways, and dispatch insisted I take the back roads to stay on schedule. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I'd been through worse. At least the weather had cleared up, leaving the road dry but bitterly cold. By the time I hit the Blackwater Hills, It was close to midnight. The forest loomed on either side of the highway, its tall pines casting long shadows in the moonlight. My headlights cut through the darkness, but the road felt oppressively narrow, the trees pressing in like walls. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the faint whine of the wind outside. I'd been driving for about an hour when I saw the first sign of trouble. It was a car, an old sedan, parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. The hood was up, and the driver's door was open, but I couldn't see anyone around. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, but the car appeared deserted. Normally, I'd stop to help. It's an unspoken rule among drivers to look out for each other. But something about the scene made my skin crawl. The car looked too clean, too new, like it had just rolled off the lot. And the way the door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze, felt wrong. I radioed out on an open channel. "Breaker, breaker. Anyone on Blackwater tonight? Just passed a car on the shoulder, mile marker 57. Looks abandoned. Anyone need assistance?" Static. After a moment, a crackling voice came through. "Get off Blackwater. Don't stop for anything." The line went dead. I stared at the radio, my heart pounding. Who had sent the message? And why? I grabbed the mic and tried again. "Hello? Who's out there? What do you mean, don't stop?" No response. I tightened my grip on the wheel, unease spreading through me. The car disappeared in my rearview mirror, and the road stretched on, dark and silent. For a while, nothing happened. But then, about 10 miles later, I saw another car. This one was parked in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, my tires squealing as I brought the truck to a stop about 50 feet away. The car's headlights were off, but its hazard lights blinked rhythmically, casting eerie flashes of orange on the surrounding trees. The doors were closed, and the windows were fogged up, but I couldn't see anyone inside. I sat there for a moment, debating what to do. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but there was no way to maneuver my rig on the narrow road. I had to move the car, or find another way through. Grabbing my flashlight, I climbed out of the cab, the icy air biting at my skin. My boots crunched on the frozen ground as I approached the car, my breath fogging in the cold. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. "Anyone in there?" No answer. When I reached the car, I shined the flashlight through the driver's side window. The interior was empty, but something about the seats caught my eye. They were damp, as if someone had been sitting there moments ago. I checked the rear seat, empty. The trunk, locked. But when I stepped back, I noticed something even stranger. Footprints. They led away from the car, disappearing into the forest on the right side of the road. The prints were shallow, barely disturbing the frost, but they were unmistakably human. And they were barefoot. A chill ran down my spine. Who would be walking barefoot in these temperatures? And why would they abandon their car in the middle of the road? I didn't have time to dwell on it. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, like whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I bolted back to the truck, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I shifted into gear, maneuvering the rig carefully around the car. The headlights barely lit the road ahead, the shadows between the trees growing darker and deeper. The whispering followed me, growing louder with every mile. "Just the wind," I muttered to myself. "It's just the wind." But I didn't believe it. 10 miles later, I saw them. Figures, standing in the middle of the road, spaced out like sentinels. They were tall and thin, their faces obscured by shadows, their bodies draped in ragged clothing. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a halt just feet away from the first figure. My headlights illuminated their faces, or what should have been their faces. Their features were distorted, like smudges on a painting, and their eyes were dark, empty voids. One of them raised an arm, pointing at me. I threw the truck into reverse, my tires spinning on the icy road. The figures didn't move, but the whispering grew deafening, filling the cab with an incomprehensible chorus of voices. Suddenly, the CB crackled to life. "Don't look at them. Keep driving." The voice startled me, but I didn't hesitate. Shifting back into gear, I pressed the accelerator and drove straight at the figures. My headlights passed through them like mist, their forms dissolving into nothingness as I barreled down the road. For the next 30 miles, the whispering followed me. I kept my eyes locked on the road, refusing to glance at the mirrors or the forest. When I finally reached the edge of Blackwater Hills, the voices stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. I didn't stop until I reached a truck stop outside Cheyenne. Shaking, I parked the rig and climbed out, my legs feeling like jelly. Inside the diner, I ordered a coffee and sat in a booth, trying to process what had happened. An older trucker sitting nearby must have noticed my state. "You all right?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "Just had a rough run through Blackwater." The man's expression darkened. "You saw them, didn't you?" I froze. "You know about the figures?" He nodded. "They're the lost. Drivers who didn't make it out. They try to warn us, or take us. Depends on their mood." I stared at him, my coffee growing cold in my hands. "Why doesn't anyone warn people about that road?" He shrugged. "Would you believe them? I never took that shortcut again, and I never drive through dense forests at night without thinking about the whispering, the figures, and how close I came to joining them." Every trucker knows the golden rule: never pick up hitchhikers. It's not just about safety, it's about stories. The tales you hear at truck stops, of drivers who picked up the wrong person and ended up missing or worse, stick with you. For years, I followed that rule without question, no matter how harmless or desperate someone looked. But one cold night on a deserted highway, I broke the rule. I wish I hadn't. It was December 2021, and I was on a cross-country haul, driving through the back roads of Kansas to avoid icy interstates. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, with heavy snow falling and the wind howling across the plains. The road ahead was nearly invisible, buried under a blanket of white, and the only thing keeping me going was the thought of reaching the truck stop 50 miles ahead. I was about halfway there when I saw him. A figure stood on the side of the road, barely visible in the storm. My headlights caught the flash of a reflective vest, the kind construction workers or highway maintenance crews wear. He was waving his arms, trying to flag me down. I hesitated, my grip tightening on the wheel. I'd heard enough horror stories to know better. But the storm was brutal, and the man looked desperate. What if he was stranded and freezing? What if he really needed help? Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. The man approached cautiously, his face partially hidden by a hood and scarf. He looked to be in his 30s, with pale skin and tired eyes. Snow clung to his clothes, and he was shivering violently. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "My car broke down a few miles back. I've been walking for hours." "You're lucky I came along," I said, motioning for him to climb in. "Get in before you freeze." He climbed into the cab, his movements stiff and awkward. As he settled into the seat, I couldn't help but notice how cold he felt, like he'd been outside for far longer than a few hours. His clothes were soaked, and his breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. "You heading toward town?" he asked, rubbing his hands together. "Yeah, there's a truck stop up ahead," I said. "I'll drop you off there." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the dashboard. For a while, we drove in silence, the storm raging around us. I tried to make small talk, asking about his car and where he was headed, but his answers were vague and distant. About 15 minutes into the drive, I started to feel uneasy. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His silence, his posture, the way his eyes darted around the cab. It all felt wrong. I glanced over at him, and for a brief moment, his scarf slipped down, revealing his neck. My stomach twisted. His skin was pale, too pale, and covered in frostbite-like marks. His lips were cracked and blue, as if he'd been out in the storm far longer than he claimed. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to look at me, his eyes dark and hollow. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked suddenly. I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Ghosts," he repeated, his voice flat. "Do you believe in them?" I don't know," I stammered. "Why?" He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. He held it out to me, his hand trembling. I glanced at the photo and felt my blood run cold. It showed a man standing beside a car, smiling. The man in the photo was wearing the same reflective vest as my passenger, and he looked exactly like him. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. When I looked up, he was staring straight ahead, his expression blank. The storm grew worse as we drove, the snow falling so heavily that it was almost impossible to see. My nerves were shot, and every minute felt like an hour. Finally, the lights of the truck stop appeared in the distance, a beacon of safety in the endless white. "We're almost there," I said, more to myself than to him. But when I glanced over, the passenger seat was empty. My heart stopped. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the icy road. The cab was empty, the doors still locked. There was no sign of the man, no footprints in the snow, no open door, nothing. I sat there, my hands gripping the wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined him? Was I losing my mind? When I finally pulled into the truck stop, I parked and ran inside, desperate to shake the cold and the fear. The diner was quiet, a few truckers hunched over steaming mugs of coffee. I approached the counter, my hands still shaking. "Hey," I said to the waitress, "has anyone else come in from the highway? A guy in a reflective vest?" She frowned. "No, you're the first person I've seen in hours." I nodded, trying to hide my unease, and sat down at the counter. As I sipped my coffee, a man sitting nearby leaned over. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a chuckle. "Maybe I have," I replied, my voice barely audible. The man's smile faded. "You didn't pick anyone up on Blacktop Road, did you?" I froze. "How did you know that?" His expression darkened. "You're not the first. They say a worker died out there years ago, froze to death after his car broke down in a storm. People still see him sometimes, waving for help, but he's not alive, not anymore." I didn't finish my coffee. I didn't stay to hear more. I left the truck stop as fast as I could, and I've never taken that route again. To this day, I don't know what I picked up that night, or if I'll see him again. But whenever I'm driving in the snow, I keep my eyes on the road and my doors locked. Because some hitchhikers aren't looking for a ride. They're looking for something else entirely.